The metal gate screeched open on that sweltering September morning in 1945, and Private William Sullivan thought he had seen everything war could throw at him. He was wrong. The stench hit first, a wall of human suffering that made even the hardened medic gag. Bodies shuffled toward the liberation convoy, skeletal figures in tattered rags, their eyes hollow with years of torment. But one woman wasn't moving toward freedom. She was crouched in the corner of a bamboo hut, her face twisted in agony, and when she saw Bill approach, she whispered 5 words that would haunt him forever. "I can't close my legs." Bill looked down and froze. Between her trembling thighs, crowning in the filth of a prison camp floor, was a baby's head. This is the true story of Sachiko Watanabe, a woman who survived the unthinkable, and the American medic who refused to let her die in the moment of liberation. What happened in that hut would test everything Bill thought he knew about medicine, humanity, and the cost of war. This is a story the history books rarely tell, but it's one that needs to be heard. Sachiko Watanabe was born in Osaka in 1920, the daughter of a textile merchant and a schoolteacher. She grew up in a Japan that was rapidly militarizing, where young women were taught that their duty was to support the empire. By 1941, Sachiko had completed nursing training, just as Japan plunged into war with the United States. She was assigned to a military hospital in Manila, tending to wounded Japanese soldiers as the empire expanded across the Pacific. But by 1944, everything had changed. The American forces were pushing back, island by island, and the Japanese military was in retreat. Manila became a target, and when the city fell in early 1945, Sachiko found herself trapped. She wasn't a soldier, but to the retreating Japanese command, anyone with medical training was valuable. She was forced to evacuate with a column of troops and civilians heading into the mountains of Luzon. They never made it. American forces cut off the retreat, and in the chaos, Sachiko's group was captured by a rogue Japanese unit that had gone feral in the jungle. These weren't the disciplined soldiers she had worked alongside in the hospital. These were men who had watched their empire crumble, who had lost everything, and who had abandoned all codes of conduct. They established a makeshift camp deep in the forest, holding civilians and Korean comfort women as prisoners, ruling through terror and violence. For Sachiko, the nightmare had just begun. The camp was a place where humanity went to die. Food was scarce, medicine non-existent, and the brutality was constant. Women were assaulted regularly by the guards, treated as property rather than people. Sachiko tried to use her nursing skills to help the other prisoners, but with no supplies, there was little she could do except watch people waste away from disease, starvation, and despair. It was in this hell that Sachiko discovered she was pregnant. The child was not conceived in love or choice, but in violence. One of the guards, a former sergeant named Takeshi Ito, had singled her out, claiming her as his possession. When she realized she was carrying his child, Sachiko felt a despair so deep it nearly broke her. In that camp, pregnancy was a death sentence. There was no prenatal care, no proper nutrition, no hope of a safe delivery. Other women had become pregnant in the camp, and Sachiko had watched them die in childbirth or lose their babies to starvation and disease. But something shifted in Sachiko when she felt the first flutter of life in her belly. Despite everything, despite the circumstances of conception, despite the hopelessness of the situation, this was a life, her child, and she made a decision that would define her. She would survive, not for herself but for the baby. She would endure whatever came, protect this innocent life that had been created in darkness, and somehow find a way to give her child a chance at the light. The months crawled by. Sachiko hid her growing belly as long as she could, knowing that if Ito discovered the pregnancy, he might see it as a burden and end it. She scrounged for food, eating insects and roots when the meager camp rations weren't enough. She exercised in secret, trying to keep her body strong, and she befriended another prisoner, Michiko Sato, a young woman from Kyoto who had been a teacher before the war. Together they formed a pact of survival, sharing resources and watching each other's backs. Then came August 15th, 1945. The camp guards gathered everyone and made an announcement that seemed impossible. Japan had surrendered. The war was over. But instead of liberation, this news brought new terror. The guards knew they would be held accountable for their crimes. Some fled into the jungle immediately. Others, including Ito, decided to eliminate evidence. They began executing prisoners. Sachiko and Michiko hid in a drainage ditch covered with palm fronds, listening to gunfire crack through the camp. They stayed there for 3 days, barely breathing, as the guards systematically murdered prisoners and then scattered into the mountains. By the time silence fell, dozens were dead. Sachiko and Michiko emerged to find the camp abandoned, littered with bodies, no food, no water, and no way to call for help. They weren't alone. About 20 prisoners had survived by hiding, including several Korean women and a handful of Filipino civilians who had been swept up in the chaos of war. This ragged group now faced a new challenge. They were free, but stranded deep in hostile jungle, with no supplies and no idea how to reach American lines. Sachiko was now 8 months pregnant, her belly swollen and heavy, her body weakened by malnutrition. Every step was agony, but she kept moving because stopping meant death. The group began a desperate march toward the coast, following a river and hoping to find an American patrol. It took 2 weeks of hellish travel, wading through swamps, evading Japanese holdouts who hadn't gotten the surrender message, and watching more of their number die from infected wounds and tropical diseases. Sachiko's feet swelled until she could barely walk. Contractions began, false labor that would grip her for hours and then fade. She knew the baby was coming soon and she was terrified. There was no doctor, no midwife, no medical supplies. If complications arose, both she and the child would die in the jungle. Then, on September 3rd, 1945, salvation appeared in the form of an American patrol. Sergeant George Palmer was leading a squad through the area, searching for stragglers and POW camps that might have been missed in the initial liberation sweeps. When his point man spotted movement in the trees, Palmer prepared for combat. Instead, he found 20 walking skeletons stumbling toward him, hands raised in surrender or plea, crying out in Japanese and Korean and Tagalog. Palmer immediately called for medical support and supplies. His squad distributed their rations and water, shocked by the condition of these survivors. That's when Private William Sullivan arrived. Bill was a medic attached to Palmer's unit, a Nebraska farm boy who had joined up in 1943 and landed in the Philippines during the final push. He had treated countless wounded soldiers, performed battlefield surgery under fire, and seen the aftermath of Japanese atrocities in liberated camps. He thought he was prepared for anything, but when Bill started triaging the survivors, checking them for immediate medical needs, he encountered Sachiko. She was sitting against a tree, her belly obviously pregnant, her face pale with exhaustion. Through broken English and gestures, she tried to explain her condition. Bill's Japanese was non-existent, but he understood enough. Pregnant, very pregnant, and in distress. He called for Dr. Eleanor Chen, the Chinese-American medical officer with the unit who could speak some Japanese. Eleanor arrived and spoke with Sachiko, her face growing grave as she learned the woman's story. Sachiko was in early labor. The baby was coming, probably within hours, and she was severely malnourished, dehydrated, and showing signs of infection. Eleanor explained to Bill and Palmer that they needed to evacuate Sachiko immediately to the field hospital 20 miles away. But Sachiko's contractions were intensifying. They might not have 20 miles worth of time. Palmer made the call. They would set up a temporary aid station right there and prepare for an emergency delivery. Bill and Eleanor gathered what medical supplies they had, a pitiful collection compared to what was needed. Some morphine, sulfa powder, bandages, and a basic surgical kit. No proper instruments for childbirth, no incubator, no blood for transfusion if things went wrong. They cleared out a native hut that the patrol had been using for shelter, laying down ponchos to create a relatively clean surface. As they worked, Sachiko's water broke. The labor was progressing fast, too fast. Eleanor examined her and her expression told Bill everything. Something was wrong. The baby wasn't positioned correctly. Sachiko was bleeding more than she should, and her exhausted, malnourished body was struggling to handle the physical demands of childbirth. Bill had delivered 2 babies before, both times in emergency field conditions, and both mothers had been healthy farm women. This was different. This was a medical crisis in the worst possible circumstances. Night fell, and the jungle came alive with sounds. The aid station was lit by lanterns and flashlights casting shadows that danced across the bamboo walls. Sachiko labored for hours, her cries echoing into the darkness, while Bill and Eleanor did everything they could to help. They gave her water, morphine for the pain and constant encouragement. Michiko stayed by her side, holding her hand and speaking softly in Japanese. The other survivors gathered outside, praying in their various languages, united in hope for this woman and her child. But as midnight approached, Sachiko's strength was failing. The contractions were ripping through her, but the baby wasn't descending properly. Eleanor performed another examination and discovered the problem. The baby was presenting with a shoulder first, a dangerous complication called shoulder dystocia. If they couldn't reposition the infant, both mother and child would die. Eleanor looked at Bill with fear in her eyes. They needed an operating room, surgical tools, and expertise neither of them fully possessed. But they were all Sachiko had. Bill made a decision. He had watched a military surgeon perform a similar maneuver once, back in a field hospital in Leyte. It was risky, painful, and required reaching inside to manually rotate the baby. But it was the only chance. He explained through Eleanor what he needed to do, and Sachiko, barely conscious from exhaustion and pain, nodded her consent. She understood. This was life or death. What happened next would stay with Bill Sullivan for the rest of his life. With Eleanor guiding him and Sachiko screaming in agony, Bill reached inside and found the tiny shoulder. He had to be gentle enough not to break the baby's clavicle or arm, but firm enough to achieve rotation. Sweat poured down his face as he worked by lantern light, his fingers slippery with blood, feeling for the anatomical landmarks Eleanor was describing. The baby was so small, so fragile. One wrong move could be fatal. Then he felt it. The shoulder rotated, the baby shifted, and suddenly there was movement. Eleanor urged Sachiko to push, and with a final, desperate effort that seemed to pull from the deepest reserves of her soul, Sachiko bore down. The baby slid free in a rush of blood and fluid falling into Bill's waiting hands. A tiny girl, blue and silent, covered in vernix and blood. For one terrible moment, nothing happened. The baby didn't cry, didn't move, didn't breathe. Bill cleared her airways with his finger, then stimulated her by rubbing her back vigorously. Still nothing. Panic rose in his throat. They had come this far, survived this much, and now this innocent child might die in the first moments of freedom. He bent down and gave tiny rescue breaths, his mouth covering the baby's nose and mouth, forcing air into miniature lungs. And then, a miracle, a tiny gasp, a sputter, and finally, a cry. Weak at first, then stronger, the sound of life asserting itself against all odds. The baby girl wailed, her lungs filling with air, her skin turning from blue to pink. Bill wrapped her in the cleanest cloth he had and placed her on Sachiko's chest. Through tears of exhaustion and relief, Sachiko looked down at her daughter and whispered something in Japanese. Eleanor translated. She said thank you. She said the baby's name would be Nozomi. It meant hope. But the crisis wasn't over. Sachiko was hemorrhaging, bleeding heavily from trauma and complications. Bill and Eleanor worked frantically to control the bleeding, packing the uterus, administering what little ergot they had to encourage contractions, and praying that her body would respond. For an hour, it was touch and go. Bill literally held pressure on the bleeding vessels while Eleanor managed the medications and fluids. Sergeant Palmer stood guard outside, keeping curious soldiers away and maintaining security. But even he found himself praying to a God he wasn't sure he believed in. Finally, slowly, the bleeding slowed. Sachiko's body, pushed beyond all reasonable limits, somehow found the strength to clot, to contract, to heal. By dawn, she was stable, weak, pale, and requiring immediate evacuation, but alive. Baby Nozomi, weighing barely 4 pounds, was wrapped in an army blanket and nestled against her mother's chest. When the medevac truck arrived at first light, Bill personally carried both mother and child to the vehicle, refusing to let anyone else handle them. The evacuation to the field hospital took 3 hours over rough jungle roads. Bill rode in the back, monitoring both patients constantly. Sachiko drifted in and out of consciousness, but every time she woke, her hand would find the baby, checking to make sure Nozomi was real, was alive, was there. At one point, through Eleanor, who was also in the truck, Sachiko asked Bill a question. Why did you save us? Why did you care so much? Bill struggled to answer. In the military, you followed orders and did your duty. But this had been more than duty. Looking at this woman, this enemy by nationality but victim by circumstance, Holding this child conceived in violence but born into freedom, Bill realized something profound. War created categories, labels, sides. But suffering was universal. Humanity was universal. When he saw that baby crowning in the filth of a liberated camp, he didn't see Japanese or American, enemy or ally. He saw a mother in desperate need and a child fighting to be born. That was all that mattered. At the field hospital, Sachiko and Nozomi received proper medical care. Sachiko needed surgery to repair internal damage, blood transfusions to replace what she had lost, and weeks of nutritional rehabilitation. Nozomi was placed in a makeshift incubator, a wooden box with hot water bottles and constant monitoring. The hospital staff, accustomed to treating wounded soldiers, found themselves captivated by this tiny patient. Nurses competed for shifts watching over baby Nozomi, feeding her donated breast milk from Filipino women, and celebrating every ounce she gained. Bill visited every day, checking on his patients even though they were no longer his responsibility. He brought supplies, small gifts, and eventually, a camera. He photographed Sachiko holding Nozomi, documenting their recovery. These weren't official military photos, but personal ones capturing something important. Evidence that even in the darkest chapters of war, there were moments of light. As Sachiko recovered, her story spread through the hospital and beyond. Journalists caught wind of the dramatic birth, and soon reporters were requesting interviews. But Sachiko refused all of them. She didn't want to be famous or used as propaganda. She just wanted to recover and figure out how to build a life for her daughter. The future was terrifying. Japan was occupied and devastated. She had no family that she knew of, no home to return to, and no resources. She was a survivor of atrocities, carrying a constant reminder of those atrocities in her arms. How could she build a life from that? Eleanor Chen became Sachiko's advocate and friend. Eleanor understood the complexity of Sachiko's situation in ways others couldn't. As a Chinese American, Eleanor had experienced racism and prejudice, had seen how war created impossible choices and categories. She began working on Sachiko's case, trying to find options. Could Sachiko emigrate? Could she claim refugee status? Could Nozomi, born after the war's end in the custody of American forces, be considered for special protection? Meanwhile, Bill Sullivan was facing his own reckoning. His deployment was ending, and he was scheduled to return to the States within weeks. He should have been elated to go home to leave the Pacific Theater behind, but he found himself reluctant to leave before knowing what would happen to Sachiko and Nozomi. He had saved their lives, and now he felt responsible for their futures. It was irrational, emotional, and completely unprofessional. It was also deeply human. Sergeant Palmer noticed Bill's attachment and pulled him aside for a conversation. Palmer was a practical man, a career soldier who had seen too many young troops form connections in war that couldn't survive peace. He warned Bill that he couldn't save everyone, couldn't fix every tragedy war created. Bill needed to go home, process what he had experienced, and rebuild his own life. Sachiko and Nozomi would find their path, but Bill couldn't let go that easily. He began writing letters, using his own time and money to contact aid organizations, refugee agencies, and religious groups that might help. He documented everything about Sachiko's case, creating a file that told her story in detail. He even wrote to his own family in Nebraska, asking if they knew of any opportunities or organizations that could assist a Japanese war survivor. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A Catholic relief organization operating in the Philippines was looking for women to train as nurses and midwives for the post-war reconstruction. They were specifically recruiting survivors who had medical experience and could help rebuild healthcare infrastructure. Eleanor brought the opportunity to Sachiko, who was initially hesitant. It meant staying in the Philippines rather than returning to Japan, at least temporarily. It meant relying on charity. But it also meant stability, training, and a chance to support herself and Nozomi. Sachiko accepted. In October 1945, she was transferred to a relief organization compound in Manila. Bill visited before his departure, bringing gifts for Nozomi and a letter for Sachiko. In it, he wrote about the experience of that night, how it had changed him, how her courage had inspired him. He included his address in Nebraska and made her promise to write and let him know how they were doing. Sachiko, through Eleanor's translation, made that promise. Their goodbye was emotional but hopeful. Bill held Nozomi one last time, marveling at how much she had grown in just weeks. from a blue, silent infant to a pink, squirming baby with a fierce will to live. Sachiko shook his hand, Japanese formality mixed with genuine gratitude, and said in halting English, "Thank you for my life." Bill responded that she had saved her own life. He had just been there to help. Bill returned to Nebraska in November 1945. He was greeted as a hero, like thousands of other returning servicemen, but he struggled to readjust. The farm life that had once defined him now seemed small and distant. The horrors he had witnessed, the suffering he had tried to alleviate, haunted his dreams. He started drinking, isolated himself, and found it hard to connect with people who couldn't understand what the war had been like. But then, in February 1946, a letter arrived. It was from Eleanor Chen, writing on Sachiko's behalf. Sachiko was doing well in the nursing program. Nozomi was thriving, gaining weight and hitting developmental milestones. They had a small room in a dormitory, simple but safe. Sachiko wanted Bill to know that they were alive because of him, and that they thought of him often. Eleanor included a photo. Sachiko and Nozomi, both healthy and smiling, standing in front of a Manila church. That letter became Bill's lifeline. He wrote back, starting a correspondence that would last years. Through letters, Bill processed his war experiences, shared his struggles with readjustment, and found purpose in following Sachiko and Nozomi's journey. Sachiko, in turn, shared her own healing process, the challenges of single motherhood in post-war Philippines, and her growing expertise as a midwife. The letters revealed parallel journeys of recovery. Sachiko was learning to separate her daughter from the circumstances of conception, to see Nozomi as her own person rather than a reminder of trauma. Bill was learning that heroism wasn't about big dramatic moments, but about showing up, caring, and doing what you could with what you had. Both were rebuilding their lives from fragments, creating meaning from chaos. In 1948, Sachiko made a significant decision. She would not return to Japan. The Philippines had become home. She had friends, work, and a community that had accepted her and Nozomi. The Catholic Relief Organization hired her full-time, training Filipino women in maternal and infant health care. Sachiko brought a unique perspective, combining Japanese nursing discipline with hard-won survival skills and deep empathy for women in crisis. Nozomi grew up in this environment, surrounded by strong women who had survived war and were rebuilding society. She was a bright child, curious and compassionate, showing early signs of her mother's strength. The circumstances of her conception were never hidden from her. Sachiko believed in honesty, but they were contextualized. Nozomi was not a child of violence. She was a child of hope, born in the moment of liberation, saved by compassionate strangers, and raised in love. Bill visited the Philippines twice in the 1950s, both times making the journey specifically to see Sachiko and Nozomi. By then, Nozomi was a young girl who called him Uncle Bill and peppered him with questions about America. Bill brought gifts, photos of Nebraska, and stories of his own life. He had married, started a family, and become a doctor, specializing in emergency medicine. The skills he had learned in war were now being used to save lives in peacetime. These visits were bittersweet. They were celebrations of survival and recovery, but also reminders of what had been lost and what scars remained. Sachiko had never fully healed from the physical trauma of that birth. She would have no more children. Bill still had nightmares about the war, moments where he woke up convinced he was back in that jungle hut, fighting to save a life by lantern light. But they also revealed something beautiful. The connections forged in crisis could endure. The humanity that emerged in war's darkest moments could survive into peace. Bill and Sachiko were never romantic partners, never family in a traditional sense, but they were bound by an experience that had defined them both. They were witnesses to each other's worst and best moments, and that created a bond that transcended normal friendship. In the 1960s, as Nozomi entered adulthood, she decided to follow her mother's path into medicine. She attended nursing school in Manila and specialized in obstetrics, driven by the story of her own birth. How many other babies and mothers could be saved with proper care, training, and compassion? Nozomi became part of a generation of Filipino healthcare workers who would eventually travel the world, bringing their skills to countries desperate for medical professionals. Sachiko watched her daughter's success with pride and something else: peace. The child conceived in violence had become a healer, The baby born in a bamboo hut during liberation had grown into a woman dedicated to bringing other children safely into the world. This was redemption, not from guilt. Sachiko had nothing to feel guilty about, but from the fear that trauma would define their story. Instead, hope had defined it. Bill and Sachiko continued corresponding into old age. Their letters became less frequent as years passed and life got busy, but they never stopped completely. On significant anniversaries, September 3rd especially, they would write, remembering that night, honoring what it meant, celebrating that both Sachiko and Nozomi had not just survived, but thrived. Bill Sullivan died in 1989 at age 68 from complications of a heart attack. Among his personal effects, his family found a box containing all of Sachiko's letters, the photographs from the Philippines, and a journal entry from September 1945. In it, he described the delivery in detail and ended with a reflection. Today I understood what I'm fighting for. Not for territory or politics or revenge. For the moment when a baby cries for the first time and a mother smiles through tears. For the possibility that humanity can survive even the worst we do to each other. For hope. His family contacted Sachiko to inform her of his passing. She was 69, still living in Manila, still working part-time as a consultant for maternal health programs. When she received the news, she wept for the first time in years. Then she gathered her daughter and grandchildren and told them the full story of their family. How they existed because of violence, yes, but also because of compassion. How a Nebraska farm boy turned medic had refused to give up on a Japanese prisoner no one else would have noticed. How humanity had asserted itself in the least likely place. Nozomi, by then a senior obstetric nurse with decades of experience, was moved to document the story properly. She tracked down Eleanor Chen, who was retired in California, and they collaborated on a detailed account. They found other survivors from that camp, including Michiko Sato, and gathered testimonies. What emerged was a micro-history of war's end, liberation's complexity, and the choices individuals make in crisis. The story was eventually published in a nursing journal in 1995, 50 years after that September night. It reached a small audience of medical professionals and historians, people who understood the significance of battlefield medicine and the human cost of war. Bill's children read it and finally understood their father's occasional distant looks, his commitment to emergency medicine, and his lifelong insistence that every patient deserved full effort regardless of who they were. Sachiko Watanabe died in 2003 at age 83. She had lived to see her daughter become a respected medical professional, her grandchildren attend university, and her great-grandchildren born into a world where the Pacific War was distant history. Her funeral in Manila was attended by hundreds, a testament to the lives she had touched through decades of midwifery and healthcare advocacy. Among the mourners was a delegation from Nebraska, descendants of Bill Sullivan who had made the journey to honor the woman their father had saved. Nozomi spoke at the funeral, telling the story one more time. She didn't shy away from the darkness, the violence of conception, the horror of the camp, the desperation of that birth, but she emphasized the light, the courage of her mother, the compassion of strangers, the determination to survive and build something meaningful from tragedy. She ended with a simple statement. I am here because people chose humanity over hate. That is my mother's legacy. That is the legacy of everyone who helped us. Today, in a nursing school in Manila, there is a small plaque dedicated to Sachiko Watanabe. It describes her as a survivor, a healer, and a symbol of post-war reconciliation. The story of her daughter's birth is taught in obstetric training as an example of emergency delivery in austere conditions. Medical students learn about Bill Sullivan's improvised techniques, Eleanor Chen's cultural competency, and the importance of never giving up on a patient. But beyond the medical lessons, there is a deeper truth. Wars end, but their consequences ripple forward through generations. The children born in conflict carry those origins but are not defined by them. Nozomi was conceived in violence but born into freedom, saved by compassion and raised in love. She became a healer who brought thousands of other babies safely into the world. That transformation from victim to victor, from darkness to light, is the real miracle of her story. The history books record the big events of World War II, the battles, the treaties, the leaders. But they rarely capture moments like this. A medic kneeling in a bamboo hut, fighting to save a life that most would have written off, a mother pushing beyond exhaustion to give her child a chance. A baby's first cry announcing that hope survives even in the worst circumstances. These moments don't change the outcome of wars, but they define what we're fighting for. I can't close my legs. 5 words that could have been the end of a story. Instead, they were the beginning of a life, a legacy, and a lesson, that in the darkest moments, when everything seems lost, there are still people who will show up, who will care, who will fight for strangers. That survival is possible. That healing is possible. That from the ashes of the worst humanity can do, something beautiful can still grow. Sachiko Watanabe survived the unsurvivable. Nozomi thrived against all odds. Bill Sullivan discovered his true calling in the chaos of war. Eleanor Chen bridged cultures to save lives. George Palmer provided leadership when it mattered most. These weren't saints or superheroes. They were ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances and choosing to do what was right, what was hard, what was necessary. Their story is not unique. Across the Pacific Theater, across every war zone in history, there are countless similar moments. Lives saved by split-second decisions. Compassion shown when hate would be easier. Connections made across enemy lines. These stories deserve to be told because they remind us of something essential. We are capable of terrible things, yes, but we are also capable of incredible grace. So the next time you hear about war, about conflict, about the divisions that seem to tear us apart, remember Sachiko and Bill. Remember that in a jungle in the Philippines, in September 1945, an American medic saved a Japanese prisoner's life not because of orders or politics, but because it was the human thing to do. Remember that a baby born in the worst circumstances became a healer. Remember that hope is not naive optimism. It is the stubborn refusal to let darkness have the final word. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel for more hidden histories and untold stories from World War II and beyond. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts and hit that like button to help us reach more people with these important narratives. These stories matter. These lives matter. And by remembering them, we honor not just the past, but the possibility of a better future.